Now we're going to talk about inherent risks, right? Because as auditors, we're trying to keep audit risks very, very low. So we need to understand the risk of material misstatement so we can adjust our substantive procedures to make sure we're keeping the risk low, because we can't adjust inherent risk or control risk. All we can do is understand the inherent risks so that we can understand what controls the client has in place and test for them, and that way we understand the risk of material misstatement. And once we understand risk of material misstatement, we can adjust our detection risk. All right, so this particular video is talking about the inherent risk in the production cycle. All right, so again, we're talking about risks to the management assertions. That's what we can test, right? I can say management says the inventory exists. Management says it's worth this much. Management says it's in this period. Management says it is inventory and not something else, and we use LIFO, not FIFO, things like that. And of course, it's all there, right? There are risks to these assertions, all right? And as we've learned before, in some cycles, the risk is greater for some assertions than others, right? Like nobody's going to purposely, probably, understate cash, right? They might overstate it, but the risk of understating cash is not real high. There's some risk, but it's not real high. Whereas the risk of understating an expense gets a little higher. Understating liabilities, quite a lot higher. Right, so you know, depending on what's going on, you can imagine that the inherent risk for various assertions changes. So this little chart kind of gives you an idea for existence, right? Yes, people make up inventory. They lie about inventory. When you meet an auditor, ask them about an inventory story. They'll tell you something exists, and then you have to go find it. It's like an Easter egg hunt. I've been on that. It's funny. So you can ask me. Next time you see me, ask me about an inventory story. So existence. High risk because they want to overstate an asset. Inventory is an asset, so they tend to want to overstate. And it's a pretty easy one to overstate because inventory, depending on how big your client is, it can be scattered all over the world. It can be in transit, right? Depending on if it's FOB shipping or FOB destination, they might own something that's on a train car somewhere, right? And it could be worth quite a lot. So existence is important, and there's very high risk to that assertion because they could say, oh, that inventory's on its way here. That inventory's in that warehouse in that other state. Oh, they'll tell you that inventory's somewhere else. So the risk to existence is very high. Same thing with valuation and allocation. Think about it in a production cycle where there's manufacturing. Inventory contains overhead. Right? That's what becomes your goods available for sale. That's your inventory, goods available for sale. So that number for goods available for sale is raw materials plus labor plus overhead, right? So those are a couple of different areas where they can fudge and make a number that's not quite the right number. Cutoff, that's high. It's pretty easy to say you've got some inventory this period. When you know you're not getting it till next period. Presentation, not as high of a risk. It's usually a little easier to tell if they've messed with how the financial statements are presented. Rights, again, they can have some inventory they don't really own. Right? Most grocery stores, you see like the beer guys stocking the beer and the bread guys. It's not actually H-E-B employees. That's because that actually is consignment inventory. So there is a slight risk that they would say they own some inventory they didn't. Completeness, very low risk. Is it possible some inventory didn't get listed? Mistakes happen, but typically that's not an issue. Wage and salary expense does come into play here somewhat. There's a moderate to high risk on wage and salary expense. We're not really talking about that in this semester, but obviously as production ensues, wages and salaries are used, and hours can be faked or not. Of course, cost of goods sold, is that number really the number? So cost of goods sold is an expense, and it's entirely based on what you valued your inventory at, right? So as you sell it, the inventory asset becomes an expense, cost of goods sold. So obviously you don't have to worry about existence because it's not an asset, and you certainly can sell something to a customer that you didn't actually have, but valuation is a big problem. All right, so relative risks for the different inventory accounts. As you know, inventory is going to be 3 separate accounts. So if you remember your cost accounting, you'll remember we have raw materials, work in process, and finished goods. And so depending on what kind of inventory it is, the risks change depending on what kind of inventory it is. So management can tend to overstate inventory. They don't tend to understate. But raw materials and finished goods are much more likely to be overstated. All right, the completeness assertion is very low. They don't tend to want to understate inventories. They're wanting, so when you're auditing, you're wanting to make sure that there's not any fake inventory. That's the big risk, right? Is that in things like raw materials, that they are saying they have raw materials they don't really have. And again, these can be actually difficult to audit because sometimes raw materials can be something that can be of different quality, right? So you can imagine that they're saying the valuation on, that's why valuation is very high risk, just because you could say you have some very high quality materials, or maybe they're low quality materials. You're in your work in process and your finished goods, you may have some allocations that are off. So it's important to understand different risks in different parts of the inventory because you audit each of them. We tend to think of inventory, I know I do. I tend to think of inventory as finished goods inventory, right? That there's stuff in a warehouse sitting there waiting for me to count them. But actually, personally, I know for a fact that is not always the case. I've certainly gone to look at, piles of sulfur. I don't know, is it even sulfur? I have to have somebody come test it and tell me that it's actually sulfur. And this happens to auditors. They'll even go to the extent of faking things. I've heard of a big scandal where auditors were told something was, I believe it was olive oil. They had a big giant vats of something, and really it was a tank of water with some oil sitting on the top because oil floats. So all the inventories are subject to risk, but just like all accounts, some kinds of risk are more likely than others. So I would suggest studying that and understanding how that works. So the main risk of material misstatement is that you need to consider your 6 primary concerns, right? So you're trying to understand this. All the inventory is included. Completeness, not a very high risk. It's been completely properly accounted and properly valued, right? Valuation, pretty high risk. Items included in inventory on the balance sheet date, existence and cutoff, big risk. They actually are the property of the client. Like I said, some things can be on consignment. That's not as big a risk, but it's certainly possible. That means they have the rights to it. If it's on consignment, they don't own it. That's what I mean. In other words, if you're to walk in H-E-B and go in the Coke aisle, Coca-Cola belongs to Coca-Cola Company, not H-E-B. They don't have the rights to it. All right. Proper presentation. You've put it in the right categories. You've disclosed anything about it. And of course, cost of goods sold are accurate. So these are the biggest risks. So there's some things that tend to go wrong, right? So on inventory to existence, right? Like we just said, it could not be recorded accurately. It could not be allocated correctly. On valuation, a big thing to consider is any of that obsolete, right? You can imagine. You can walk in a warehouse, and you can walk in that warehouse, and it's electronics. It's like a Best Buy, and you can do their inventory, and they say, "Here's all our iPhone 4s," right? iPhone 4, no, who has that, right? Who's going to buy that? It's obsolete. You can't use it anymore. But they manufactured it. They have it on their books. Right, but it's not worth anything. So inventory has to be valued at lower of cost or market. Right, we learned that in intermediate, lower of cost or market. So might not be worth what they're saying it is, even if they really did put all that money in it. Right, so you can imagine you check the raw materials. Yep, they spent that money. Check the labor. Yep, those people worked on it. Check the overhead. Those allocations are correct. That's really the right overhead, and that thing costs $10, right? The finished goods inventory, $10. But you know what? They can only sell it for $4. It's obsolete. So that's an issue. Cut off existence. Yes, they do fake inventory. Sometimes presentation and disclosure comes up where inventory is collateral. That needs to be disclosed. They have to have the rights to it. As I said, it's not on consignment. They don't very often leave items off inventory. Wages and salary expense, yes, they tend to want to leave that off or not recorded at the proper amount. Cost of goods sold, again, if you got off track back here in inventory, back in raw materials or work in process and labor, then your cost of goods sold is going to be off. All right, so when we come back, next video we're going to talk about internal controls, right? Because now we got to test that control risk.